Hi everyone, good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to have here Professor Brook Sadler, almost concluding our event after 4 days of and many interesting presentations and discussions. And I say almost because we have one more conference following this one, Professor Tiago Teixeira's conference. Well, Brook Sadler is Associate Professor and Graduate Coordinator in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies of University of South Florida. She received her PhD in philosophy from Duke University in 2001 and earned tenure in the philosophy department of University of South Florida before moving to Humanities and Cultural Studies in 2013. Her diverse interests include Kantian ethics, shared intentionality, the ethics of marriage, philosophy of love and sex, philosophy of emotion, philosophy and film, feminist theory, and poetry. She is a recipient of the University of South Florida Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching Award and a past president of the Florida Philosophical Association. Among her most relevant works about our theme, I highlight her recent contribution to the Routledge Handbook of Love in Philosophy, whose title is Love and Marriage. Well, today she will offers us a lecture called Marriage Problems. We will have 1 hour and a half, and people can send questions in our chat in YouTube, which professor can answer and comment if we have time for it.
Thank you, Edison. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Eduardo for the invitation to speak with you today. And thank you all for being here to listen. I know we spend so much more time online and in virtual context than we used to, and I really do appreciate your presence here today. I am going to talk about marriage problems, and let me pull up my slide presentation for you. Right. I hope you are seeing the screen.
Yes, I think it's on screen.
Okay, thank you. It's a little hard for me to make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, great. What are marriage problems? If you ask spouses, they will tell you that the problems in their marriage include arguments over money, childcare, household tasks, work schedules, and maybe sex. I won't be talking directly about these problems, the problems that married couples face in their daily lives, and the kinds of negotiations, compromises, sacrifices, and resentments that they generate. But some of what I have to say will explain why couples face these problems, the disappointments and disagreements that married couples experience arise from a long history of marriage practice that shapes their expectations for married life, the norms of marital behavior, and especially the gender roles that structure the lives of spouses. The day-to-day problems of married couples arise in response to economic conditions that differentially affect the lives of men and women, and hence of husbands and wives. These problems are faced through social policies and laws that create or restrict their opportunities according to their sex or gender. In other words, as feminists have long observed, the personal is political. What feels most emotionally charged and intimate in personal relationships, when married couples argue, or when they suppress disagreements in order to keep the peace, is often a function of larger social forces. Marriage problems between spouses are also simultaneously reflections of the larger sociocultural situation. I will be linking together 5 interrelated problems at the core of contemporary debates about marriage. First, there is the definitional problem. What is marriage? What is the meaning of marriage, and what are its defining or necessary features? I believe that there is no single correct answer to these questions. Marriage is a social practice that must be understood descriptively in its social and historical context. Many discussions of marriage founder on account of being ahistorical or false to the wide array of current marriage practices. My discussion will focus on the practice of marriage in the United States. I hope there will be applications to other contexts and that I can learn from the audience, from questions at the end, about marriage practice in Brazil and elsewhere. As a social practice, marriage must also be understood normatively. It is always in progress, subject to social transformation as ideas and ideals for human life change. Thus, it's not unreasonable to suggest ways of reforming marriage. Consideration of such reforms is often what sparks interest in defining marriage, and among the most prominent suggestions for reform have been petitions to extend marriage to persons historically excluded. Thus, the definitional problem leads to the extension problem. Should marriage be extended to include same-sex couples, more than two spouses, or non-sexual unions? I suggest that apart from preserving the name, marriage, there's nothing inherently objectionable about such extensions, though again, social context matters greatly. I will argue that dyadic sexual relationships may offer a unique ethical value, but I will refer to these relationships as commitments rather than marriages, in order to indicate that they depart from both the civil and religious foundations of modern marriage. Ultimately, it's not the word that matters, but the role the practice plays in our lives, individually and collectively. The third area of debate is the civil justice problem. Does the state have a legitimate interest in supporting marriage? Is civil marriage supported at the expense of non-married citizens? On my view, the most pressing and important revision to marriage practice is the need to remove state support. The social value and function of marriage have already changed dramatically. It is time for the law and the government to catch up with these realities. Justice for all citizens and the future of gender equality may depend on it. To suggest that the state disestablish civil marriage, making marital status unnecessary for obtaining legal rights and benefits, points to the foundational problem. Is marriage foundational to civil society, as is often claimed? Can we imagine a political order that does not assume the married couple and the nuclear family as the natural basis for or pre-political paradigm of the organized state? I think we can and must, but I'll only be able to gesture in that direction here. Finally, there is the closely related social engineering problem. What is ultimately at stake in imagining a new approach to marriage or in reclaiming a traditional view of marriage? On my view, the stakes are high. Gender equality and racial equality hang in the balance, as well as freedom of sexual orientation and freedom of association. This is a lot of ground to cover in one lecture, so my arguments will necessarily be incomplete, but I think there's some value in seeing the interrelatedness of these problems and in perceiving how they can be addressed connectedly or coherently. My paper is going to be divided into two parts. In the first part, I address marriage as a social practice in the United States context. In the second part, I introduce my view of commitment as an ethical ideal, as a way of offering a new understanding of what might be most valuable at the core of marriage practice. Part one, marriage practice in the United States. In the United States, since the 1990s, the problem of defining marriage or determining its true meaning has been galvanized by the movement to legalize same-sex marriage. Supporters of lesbian and gay marriage argue that the sex of spouses is irrelevant to marriage, and that marriage is not fundamentally heterosexual, nor necessarily tied to procreation. Supporters of same-sex marriage focus on marriage as a public affirmation of love and commitment, and as an important legal right that bolsters lesbian and gay families. As greater social acceptance of homosexuality dawned, supporters of same-sex marriage were emboldened to argue that it's unjust to exclude same-sex partners from the legal rights and benefits conferred by marriage. Opponents of same-sex marriage insist that marriage is necessarily heterosexual and essentially tied to procreation. The opponents of same-sex marriage have sometimes been overt in their denunciation of homosexuality, but sometimes they claim to respect love between same-sex partners, even advocating for their right to form civil unions, while maintaining that they do not qualify for participation in the sacrosanct institution of marriage. This fundamental disagreement between supporters and opponents of same-sex marriage highlights their common regard for the institution of marriage, even as it exerts a pressure to determine who is right about what marriage really is or should be. It seems that in order to determine whether marriage can be properly extended to same-sex partners, we must have a settled understanding of what marriage is, of how it is defined, of what its essential features are. Thus, the definitional problem appears to be integrally connected to the extension problem. Can marriage be extended to same-sex partners? Is marriage necessarily dyadic between only two partners? Can it be extended to more than two spouses? Can marriage include people who have no sexual or romantic ties, such as siblings, or friends who share property, or neighbors who agree to co-parent each other's children? In the United States, the public debates around same-sex marriage have often attempted to resolve the definitional problem by reference to tradition. Hence, many opponents of same-sex marriage defended what they called the traditional view of marriage. According to the traditional view, marriage is a union of one man and one woman. When the United States Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, in 1996, it seemed downright obvious to most lawmakers and to the public at large that marriage was between one man and one woman. If anything, the passage of DOMA, rather than silencing those who dissented from tradition, probably stoked debate about an institution that most people had never questioned. Despite the prevalence of divorce, most people saw the problem with marriage in terms of personal failure. They chose the wrong partner, they didn't have the requisite maturity, or they were disappointed in love. Most people did not see that marriage was failing as an institution to meet the needs of citizens in a society dramatically transformed by women's rights, civil rights, economic changes, and medical technology, including reliable contraception and legal abortion. Certainly, the traditional view of marriage was the one that most people then accepted in the 1990s. Within the American context, the most common form of marriage, the one sanctified by law, public policy, religion, social norms, and countless representations in the media, was both heterosexual and dyadic. But the defense of traditional marriage was about far more than a definition. It was about a way of life that was no doubt nostalgic for many lawmakers in the 1990s. They were part of the baby boom generation. Following World War II, their own parents were notorious for reinstating what were effectively 19th century gender roles. Middle-aged policymakers in the 1990s were raised on ideals of family life reflected in popular TV shows from the late 50s and early 60s, things like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. I don't know if those will be shows that you've heard of, but very, very popular representations of traditional marriage. The defense of traditional marriage was really a defense of a social and economic order in which husbands are primary breadwinners, whose role is to provide financial support for their wives and children, and in which wives are responsible for reproductive labor, childcare, and domestic labor and nurturance. These roles have been of paramount significance, not just in the lives of individuals who frame their personal aspirations and identities around them, but in the construction of the larger political and economic systems of the United States. It's important to recognize that the defense of traditional marriage, framed as resistance to same-sex marriage, was always about more than sexual orientation. Marriage is implicated in family structure, the division of labor, the place of women in society, the welfare of children, and a host of associated traditions that have been built concomitantly. But by the late 20th century, the divorce rate was rising. More and more women were having children out of wedlock, sometimes by choice. In fact, in 1991, then Vice President Dan Quayle stirred up a lot of controversy by making some remarks about a TV show called Murphy Brown, in which the central character, a professional woman, decides to have a child and raise it on her own. Dan Quayle, Vice President Dan Quayle, remarked that this character in this TV show was mocking the importance of fathers. It really caused a lot of controversy right before the 1992 presidential election. It seemed to Quayle and to conservative family values-oriented thinkers of the time that Murphy Brown was representing a completely irresponsible choice to have a child out of wedlock. But in reality, many women were actually choosing that, and the TV show simply represented a significant shift that was taking place in society. So by the late 20th century, we have the divorce rate rising, more children born to unwed parents, women choosing to have children outside of marriage. The birth rate has declined, and cohabitation of unmarried partners has become increasingly common. Indeed, a whole industry of marriage counselors and therapists had sprung up to confront the reality of pervasive marital discord. Lots of unhappy marriages. For defenders of traditional marriage, these were all troubling signs of an institution in decline. The attempt to rehabilitate traditional marriage in American life by defining marriage as a union of one man and one woman looks like a misplaced response to the perceived crisis. Americans weren't confused about the heterosexual or dyadic nature of marriage. They were increasingly rejecting the confines of a practice that was beginning to look outmoded. Contraception and legal abortion made sex outside of marriage less dangerous for women, separating the link between marriage and sexuality. The so-called sexual revolution and the new pornography made sex into a recreational activity more than a procreative one, again, separating the link between sexuality and marriage. Women's access to higher education entailed their eligibility for better jobs, and women's entry into the paid workforce meant women did not strictly need male financial support. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Levy versus Louisiana in 1968, which made it illegal to discriminate against children based on their parents' marital status, the stigma and disadvantages attached to so-called illegitimate children began to disappear. Marriage simply did not fulfill the same social and economic functions it once had. The prospect of same-sex marriage provided an excuse to politically reinvest in marriage while scapegoating lesbians and gays as if they were the primary threat to the institution, which was really being challenged by heterosexual defectors. The defense of traditional marriage in the 1980s and 1990s was also discursively connected to other related social trends in the United States. The rise of Christian conservatism, which monopolized public talk about family values, and racially inflected debates about government welfare programs, especially support for unwed mothers. To defend traditional marriage was thus not merely to reject same-sex marriage, it was to insist on the primacy of the nuclear family and patriarchal religion, as well as to renounce the role of government in securing the welfare of citizens who do not conform. Among the nonconformists were many African American women and families whose complex social and economic position made it difficult for them to arrange their lives according to the traditional pattern: married, nuclear family, male breadwinner, female homemaker. Thus, the insistence on reinforcing the traditional view of marriage has always been in tension with the realities of life for many Black Americans. I want to introduce you to this image here, this meme with the umbrellas. This was actually just sent to me yesterday. It's the first time I saw it, and I couldn't resist including it in the presentation today. This image is a meme circulated currently that encourages people to accept and reinforce the patriarchal structure and gender roles in marriage and the nuclear family. And if you look at the umbrellas, of course, we have the Christian concept of Christ at the top, overlooking and justifying a patriarchal order, social order. But if we look at what the roles are, they really do reinforce this very 19th century notion that the husband is supposed to be the provider for the family. He's going to be the breadwinner, the one who makes the money. He's also going to protect the family. It's not quite clear what that means. It's a pretty vague notion. And lead the family, be the decision maker. And in these capacities as protector, leader, and provider, the husband is hierarchically positioned above the wife, whose roles are to comfort, teach, and nurture. And those it doesn't say in this meme or in this schematic representation that the wife must stay home to perform those roles. And yet, one might think that if those are the primary attributes of a woman or a wife, to comfort, teach, and nurture, then she will also adopt social roles beyond the home that reinforce those same gendered attributes. And in fact, looking at the division of looking at labor statistics from the United States, you see an overconcentration of women in roles that require teaching young children, nurturing or providing comfort. So nursing work, teaching children, daycare, those areas of paid employment are overrepresented by women. And then children are supposed to love and obey. So I couldn't help but include this. It just came to my attention yesterday, and it's such a crystallization of the kind of patriarchal view of marriage and family life that's at stake. And the fact that this is being widely circulated among ordinary middle-class Americans today tells you something about the state of discourse, that there are a lot of people who would like to push us backward to reinstate this view of marriage. Even now, the traditional view of marriage is often touted as expressing the central truth about marriage and family. Here is one current example. So this goes beyond the meme to an intellectual book, philosophical book, by Sharif Girgis, Ryan Anderson, and Robert George. In their 2020 reissue of a slim book from 2012 titled What is Marriage?, Girgis, Anderson, and George defend marriage as limited to one man and one woman. They write, there is a distinct form of personal union and corresponding way of life, historically called marriage, whose basic features do not depend on the preferences of individuals or cultures. Like many defenses of traditional marriage, the claim of its universality, its independence of individual preference and cultural difference, is simply false. Anthropological and historical evidence give us a wide variety of types of marriage practice, including polygamous, same-sex marriage, and arranged marriages, as well as divergent child-rearing practices, habitation arrangements, family structures, and sexual practices. In other words, highly varied ways of life. Importantly, even within a circumscribed focus on the American context, the traditional view that is being defended is misrepresented. If traditional marriage is heterosexual and dyadic, it is also patriarchal and racist. Yet those aspects of the tradition have been conveniently ignored or disingenuously sidestepped by defenders of traditional marriage. Defenders of the traditional view, according to which marriage is the, quote, union of one man and one woman, fail to acknowledge that the union historically meant the subjugation of one woman to one man. When husband and wife were united in marriage, the wife lost her independent legal identity, while the husband's legal authority was extended to cover her. Hence, these laws are called the laws of coverture. A union of man and woman may sound spiritually, erotically, or emotionally transcendent to today's ears. But in fact, union was at best a euphemism that obscured a socio-political system designed to efface women's participation in public life. The laws of coverture meant that a married woman was completely subject to the authority of her husband. In the 19th century, upon marrying, a woman lost all legal title to her property, her home, and her income, if she had any, her children, and even control over her own body, along with a host of other legal restrictions. In marriage, a woman took her husband's name because she no longer had a legal identity of her own. And I'll just add that most American women today still take their husband's name when they marry, never knowing or even questioning the reason for this tradition. Some 19th century writers saw clearly just how subjugated women were in marriage, comparing a married woman's legal status with that of a slave. But in the United States, slaves were prohibited from marrying, which meant that marriage also functioned to uphold white supremacy, since important legal rights and benefits, especially those relating to child custody, taxation, and inheritance, were attached to marital status. African Americans have felt the effects of these early deprivations and disruptions to normative family life for generations. Anti-miscegenation laws, which forbid whites from marrying people of color, but importantly, it did not forbid people of color marrying each other across racial lines. So if you were Chinese, you could marry a Black person, but neither a Chinese or a Black person could marry a white person. Anti-miscegenation laws, which forbid whites from marrying people of color, further solidified marriage as a racist practice until 1967, when such laws were deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the last remnants of the laws of coverture were not revoked until the 1990s, just when the debate about same-sex marriage started to flare up. The patriarchal and racist laws at the heart of modern marriage may be the stuff of history, but they are the stuff of recent history, This history is present and alive in the relationships, values, and economic prospects of millions of people. If traditional marriage is correctly identified as the historically central version of marriage practiced in the United States, it is important to see how it came to be that way. In other words, the definitional problem should not be treated as arising in a historical vacuum. The tradition was generated by sexist political ideology, patriarchal law, capitalism, and gender essentialism. Today, we confront the persistent social and economic effects of these influences. According to sexist political ideology, only men could participate in the public domain of politics, commerce, science, education, etc., the entire public sphere of life. Women's proper role was in the private domain of the home, where their contribution to the social order was limited to nurturing future citizens, more specifically to nurturing the future of males to enter the public sphere. According to patriarchal law, a woman's legal identity was covered by her husband. Hence, she could not own property, take custody of her children, file for divorce, sign a legal contract, vote, or represent herself in any public or legal matter. The restrictions on women's participation in public life, as well as severe social censure for extramarital sex, meant that marriage was compulsory for most women who had few, if any, options to support themselves financially or socially outside of marriage. According to 3, capitalism, women's unpaid labor at home and underpaid labor in the workforce functioned to increase profits for men. Women constituted an exploited class. According to 4, gender essentialism, men and women have fundamentally different natures, as given by biology or by God or both, that require them to occupy different spheres of life. Women must stay home and nurture the family, and men must participate in the public world where the use of reason is necessary to conduct the affairs of men and society. These 4 historical strands are mutually reinforcing. Arguably, the root of the problem is 4, gender essentialism. This would explain why Anderson and George, in their January 2020 essay decrying the advent of same-sex marriage, which was legalized in the United States in 2015, they managed to avoid saying anything in particular against homosexuality or lesbian and gay families. Instead, their target is the very idea that gender identity can be divorced from biology. They write, "There's a logic here. If we can't see the point of our sexual embodiment where it matters most, in marriage, we'll question if it matters at all. Hence the push to see gender as fluid and as existing along a spectrum of non-binary options." Gerges, Anderson, and George thus defend not just the traditional view of marriage, one man and one woman, but an even more conservative position they call conjugal marriage. The conjugal view holds that marriage must be only between a man and a woman because it is inherently ordered to procreation. Marriage, on their view, cannot properly be a relationship between persons of the same sex because their attempts at bodily union through sex cannot be complete, since they do not, quote, coordinate toward a common biological end, the production of a child. According to the conjugal view, love is an insufficient motive for marriage, and state support for marriage cannot be based either on the way in which loving relationships are central to personal flourishing, or on stabilizing the nuclear family or providing adult care for children, which lesbian and gay marriages may do as well as traditional marriages. These proponents of the conjugal view maintain that what the state must support is the link between biological sex, procreation, and family life. As their remarks make clear, the point is to sustain the binary gender roles of husband and wife as naturally justified by the biological difference between male and female. Some modern defenders of the traditional view of marriage are happy to accept sexist political ideology, patriarchal values, capitalist gains for men, and gender essentialism, sometimes overtly and sometimes covertly. Many defenders of traditional marriage are simply ignorant of the historical underpinnings that created this view of marriage and its long legacy. Instead, they see its persistence as simply a matter of individual choice. Women choose to focus on family and children, while men choose to focus on work, career, politics, and matters of public concern. There is widespread ignorance of the ways in which these choices have been constructed by law, social policy, and economic factors. The union of man and woman that once made individual women subject to their husbands has historically made women as a class into secondary citizens. Consigned to the domestic realm for centuries, women were prohibited from participating in the creation and development of fundamental American institutions. Gradually liberated by law from this secondary status in the 20th century, women have yet to succeed in remaking American institutions to serve their legitimate interests. The unpaid labor of women in the home, together with the underpaid labor of women in the workforce and a dearth of social policies designed to support working women, have been primary mechanisms by which men have accrued economic, political, and social capital. Under the best of scenarios, it will take women another 100 years to catch up. And this is some data that's come out in 2018 from the World Economic Forum, looking at a variety of factors globally. How long will it take for gender equality to truly be reached? And the suggestion is that it'll take more than 100 years to close the gender gap and more than 200 years to achieve economic gender parity. As long as marriage continues to promote the current sex-based division of labor, men will not fully benefit from the morally edifying work of parenting and care for family. And women will not fully benefit from the socially and politically edifying work of creating culture in all its forms, full participation in the arts and sciences, education, technology, sports, politics, governance, everything. What many defenders of traditional marriage fail to see is that the entry of women into the workforce has not significantly diminished their roles as mothers and homemakers. Marriage contributes to these gender norms that keep women working effectively overtime as both paid laborers in the workforce and unpaid laborers at home. But men have not taken the corollary step of investing in home and children. Men are performing their paid labor, but are not significantly increasing their commitment to fatherhood, childcare, or domestic life. So in some sense, there's a cultural shift that's taking place, but it hasn't really taken both parallel tracks. It's taken one track. Women have become more capable of taking on the work that men do, but men have not invested in taking on the work that women have traditionally done. The historical basis of traditional marriage is also largely ignored even by supporters of same-sex marriage, who in their eagerness to allow lesbian and gay partners access to this important social institution have been willing to overlook its sexist and racist history. For example, in its 2015 decision supporting same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court of the United States largely ignores the troubling history of marriage. Instead, the court focuses on the personal value of marriage to spouses and the centrality of marriage to civil society. Among other things, the court extols marriage as contributing to individual autonomy, overlooking the laws of coverture that annihilated married women's autonomy, and disregarding the current socioeconomic realities that still make many women beholden to their husbands. By ignoring the fact that traditional marriage was established as an overtly patriarchal and racist institution, the court fails to consider the ways in which the tradition has made sexism and racism, not just marriage, central to civil society. What supporters of same-sex marriage correctly perceive is that marital status confers not only social acceptability, but access to important rights and benefits. Among the legal rights and benefits granted to married persons are the right to inherit property from a spouse without taxation, the right to custody of children raised in common, the right to visitation in hospitals and prisons, and immigration rights, to name just a few that are very important. For many, marriage provides access to affordable health care through a spouse's health insurance policy. In a nation without universal health care, marital status may be the only thing that makes access to health care affordable. For reasons relating to legal rights and benefits, extending marriage to same-sex partners obviously contributes to greater social justice. More people have more of their basic needs addressed and are not discriminated against on the basis of an arbitrary criterion, sexual orientation. Thus, a defense of the conjugal view of marriage or the traditional view of marriage by excluding lesbian and gay partners unjustly denies them access to important public goods. Some such defenders are willing to accept the price, sacrificing the equality of lesbian and gay persons for the sake of sustaining the traditional or conjugal view of marriage. Though I think the exclusion of same-sex partners from marriage is unjust, their inclusion does seem to press the problem of extension. If gays and lesbians are unjustly excluded from important legal rights and benefits conferred by marriage, then aren't all unmarried people likewise treated unjustly? Why should this particular form of relationship, a dyadic sexual union, be upheld at the expense of the welfare of other citizens? Some see same-sex marriage as the first step on a troubling, slippery slope by which marriage can come to mean anything. Polygamy, marriage to a dog. These are the claims you frequently hear. I think it's right to imagine that marriage could, in theory, come to mean anything. But this only looks like a slippery slope argument if we treat marriage as ahistorical, as a matter of definition, rather than a social practice, which is subject to social transformation. What marriage is, what it means, who it includes, and who is excluded by it, how it is practiced, all of these are highly variable according to social and historical context. Social practices do not evolve in completely random ways. They evolve in response to complex social factors. There is no widespread or compelling reason for people to seek to marry their dogs. Unless the practice of pet ownership were to change radically, it's hard to see why people would begin to associate marriage with their pets. But we can see why people have begun to think of heterosexual dyadic marriage as only one way of conducting an ethically valuable, economically successful, personally rewarding, socially responsible life. As women's rights and economic prospects have changed, so have the kinds of human relationships, family arrangements, and child-rearing practices. These developments must be met with commensurate developments in how the state allocates resources and determines legal rights. Marital status no longer suffices, if it ever did, to meet the needs of citizens. We can see why the state's refusal to look beyond marriage to support the legitimate interests that unmarried people have is increasingly problematic. Many people are unmarried, whether by choice or due to the death of a spouse, divorce, or or other unfortunate circumstances. Many people find themselves in need of social supports of the kind the state now confers only on married people. It's time for marriage to evolve. It's time for the state to take steps to separate marital status from citizens' legitimate interests in children's welfare, property, inheritance, taxation, immigration, and much more. In fact, this transformation has already begun, as many of the issues once addressed by marital status are now addressed through child custody arrangements, prenuptial contracts, power of attorney, etc. What traditionalists bemoan as the demise of Western civilization, we may instead embrace as the vanguard of a genuine equality and political liberty. So in the first part, I have talked about the traditional view, conjugal view of marriage, and the fight for same-sex marriage, tried to put some social context on the practice of marriage in the United States. And I'm now going to move to the next, part 2, an egalitarian revision, marriage as an ethical ideal. In sum, the view I have set out sees American marriage as a historical practice, open to revision, but rooted in patriarchal law, sexist political ideology, gender essentialism, and capitalism, and reinforcing white supremacy. One might accept this critical orientation toward marriage and even go the next step to advocate for the marriage-free state, to borrow Chambers' phrase, in the hope of securing justice for all citizens and advancing the interests of all, not just those who are unmarried. Yet, one might be struck with some lingering doubts. After all, I have said nothing about love. I have seen marriage from the outside, as it were, rather than from the inside, from the point of view of people who are married or hoping to marry. To disestablish civil marriage in the name of justice is one thing, but where does that leave marriage? Is there any common meaning or sense of marriage practice that could be preserved outside of government involvement? What is the value of marriage when viewed from the inside, as it were, from the perspective of people choosing to marry now? Can we give an account of the value of marriage that is not dependent upon its patriarchal, sexist, racist underpinning, and is yet reflective of real-world practice? Defenders of the conjugal view of marriage wish not only to support, defenders of the conjugal view of marriage wish not only to preserve state support for marriage, but to promote their conservative, heterosexual-only view of marriage as the vital center of society. They believe that conjugal marriage has a value that cannot be acknowledged by any revisionist view. According to Gerges et al., revisionist views of marriage reject the procreative purpose of marriage and the gender roles of husband and wife, insisting instead that what matters is love. They claim that the revisionist view is a vision of marriage as, in essence, a loving emotional bond, one distinguished by its intensity, a bond that needn't point beyond the partners, in which fidelity is ultimately subject to one's own desires. In marriage, so understood, partners seek emotional fulfillment and remain so long as they find it. On their view, conjugal marriage preserves a kind of moral seriousness that revisionist marriage lacks. The revisionist, they claim, ties marriage to transient, even fickle emotion rather than commitment, to sexual desire rather than biological complementarity and procreative ends, to personal fulfillment rather than public good, to temporary satisfaction rather than long-term support, to pleasure rather than principle. On their view, revisionists are promoting an ethos that lacks moral gravitas, is hedonically oriented, and denies social responsibility. They fear that if we adopt a revisionist practice of marriage, or continue with it, American society will slide into a state of moral decay. John Finnis suggests that without a proper remaritalizing of society, which includes limiting sex to marriage and prohibiting contraception and divorce, our society will become extinct. If our civilization itself is what's at stake, then clearly we had better be as clear as we can about what marriage is and how it relates both to individual flourishing and the public good. In the public discourse that has arisen largely in response to the extension problem regarding same-sex marriage, revisionists and supporters of same-sex marriage have often relied on assumptions about the value of marriage that tend to support their opponents' complaints. Supporters of same-sex marriage argue that gay and lesbian persons should have the right to marry in order to receive associated legal rights and benefits, and to celebrate their love. From the point of view of traditionalists or conjugalists, the first reason can be met through alternative legislative means, and the second point affirms their worry that revisionist marriage is founded on love, which they believe is a feeble basis for an institution that is supposed to hold society together. My aim now is to introduce a view of modern marriage that is not connected to state support, not based in religious practice or theology, not fundamentally patriarchal or sexist, and not limited to the hedonic, transient, emotional, or individual aims that are said to characterize the revisionist position. I want to introduce a conception of marriage as an ethical relationship based on equality, not gender or sex, complementarity, or gender essentialism. Since I argued in the first part of the paper that marriage is a social practice, I'll maintain the view I articulate is consistent with the experiences of marriage for many people today. It captures something real about marriage practice. Many people aspire to create a marriage relationship that encompasses the features of the ethical ideal I will describe. In this way, my view can be seen as both explaining why people experience marriage as a good, even as it is only one good among others that are open to citizens in a politically liberal society. To limit confusion, to limit confusion, as well as to symbolically separate my view from that of traditionalists, conjugalists, and other revisionists, I will refer not to marriage but to commitment as the name of the ethical ideal that is at the heart of the modern marriage practice. I draw my inspiration for thinking of commitments as the ethical ideal from Kant, and I could talk more about that if people are interested. As an ethical ideal, commitment addresses equally the two central features of ethical thought. It attends both to the well-being of the individual and to proper regard for the other. The ethical ideal of commitment can be understood as an ideal form of friendship. This distinguishes the well-being of the self and the proper regard for the other that are exhibited in personal relationships from the same concerns as they are exhibited in impersonal relationships, such as relations between co-workers, neighbors, or fellow citizens. Thinking of the ethical ideal of commitment as a friendship also allows us to capture the voluntary and personal nature of the relationship. We choose our friends according to our interests, circumstances, shared projects, and common outlook, to name a few of the many factors that shape friendship. Thinking of commitment as an ethical ideal of friendship also helps us to think of commitments as free of state regulation and involvement, just as ordinary friendships are not a direct concern of the state. For convenience, I think I skipped one. For convenience, I will refer to the persons who commit to each other as ideal friends or as partners. Ideal friends undertake a commitment that is mutual and reciprocal. There are no asymmetries with respect to the ethical ground of their commitment. There are no distinctions by sex or gender, no social roles to occupy. There is no husband or wife. Ideal friends, in choosing each other, have elected to invest heavily in their partner. This investment is a kind of concentrated ethical attention. In choosing a partner, an ideal friend creates an opportunity to fulfill what Kant calls wide or imperfect duties. These are moral duties for which the moral law cannot specify action. There is wide latitude or discretion on the part of the moral agent with respect to when and how the duty is fulfilled. Narrow duties set minimum moral standards, which can never be properly transgressed. They indicate the moral floor, which we cannot sink below. Wide duties show us that there is no moral ceiling. There is no upper limit on how much good we can do in the world. Put another way, narrow duties tell us not to violate the autonomy of persons, whereas wide duties tell us to promote or cultivate their autonomy. Narrow duties specify what we owe to everyone. Wide duties allow us to decide with whom we will become ethically involved. Put again, narrow duties demonstrate our respect for others by not infringing upon their autonomy. Wide duties show our moral love for others by encouraging us to actively promote their autonomy. For ideal friends, in making a commitment to each other, they thereby undertake to promote each other's autonomy or to cultivate each other's happiness. Any two friends may participate in advancing the happiness of any two friends may participate in advancing the other's happiness and thereby display some moral virtue in fulfillment of their wide duties. In fact, one can fulfill wide duties without focusing on personal relationships at all. One might take up charitable work in a social organization, for example, and promote the welfare of others by teaching adult literacy, feeding the poor, volunteering at a health clinic, building homes for the indigent, etc. This observation is not incidental. In a marriage-free state, there will be many ways for citizens to promote the good and to exhibit moral virtue outside of the dyadic personal relationship of marriage, or in my view, ideal friendship. And there is no intrinsic reason to think that these other forms of ethical action are of less social value or lesser moral importance. In fact, in a world where so many people face such extreme need, it may be well for us to benefit others instead of investing solely in our personal relationships. So ideal friends commit mutually and reciprocally to promote each other's happiness and autonomy. Notice that this arrangement means that each partner is positioned to receive as much as she gives. A promotes B's flourishing, who is thereby better equipped to promote A's flourishing, and vice versa. Both partners are simultaneously committed to promoting the welfare of the other, which has the effect of securing, so far as possible, happiness or well-being for oneself. An ideal friendship is an ideal for several reasons. One is that the simultaneous promotion of autonomy of each partner may not be easily achieved in the real world. Sometimes the end of the partners may come into conflict. Sometimes one partner's limitations or failures may jeopardize the others receiving the return on her investment that she deserves. But these sorts of problems are, I think, ineradicable features of human life, not indications of some structural unsoundness in the notion of an ideal friendship or commitment. But another sense in which such a commitment is an ideal of friendship concerns the ends involved. In ordinary friendships, we promote each other's autonomy through helping each other to achieve our ends. But we do this in rather limited ways. A may promote B's interest in learning to play the piano. B may promote A's interest in going to college. A may look after B's children. B may help A to overcome a drug addiction. Ordinary friendships typically involve limitations on our involvement. We attend to only some of our friends' ends for a limited period of time. And the friendship may be mutual, but not fully reciprocal. A may be more helpful and attentive to B than B is to A. An ideal friendship, on the view I'm offering, is ideal because it maximizes our ethical regard for the other. In an ideal friendship, partners undertake to promote each other's ends without limitation in every domain of life and permanently. It is in part because of the moral seriousness of this relation that it is proper to regard it as a commitment. Though it may be useful to acknowledge the commitment publicly or explicitly, no vows need to be taken. As an ideal that encompasses all of the ends of the partner, the commitment provides limitless opportunities for one to fulfill wide duties in promoting the happiness and autonomy of the partner. And since our ends involve long-term projects and plans, developing capacities, changing desires, our commitment must be, in principle, permanent. Because the commitment focuses on the whole person and the development of her humanity, it is not limited to any particular aspect of her being. Therefore, an ideal friendship, partners will attend to each other in every way possible: emotional, intellectual, physical, sexual, social, material, and familial, and anything else I've missed. But because an ideal friendship is not tied to religious practice, gender roles, or state institutions, there are no presumptions about how the partners will choose to fulfill their commitment to each other. They may or may not elect to have biological children together or to raise adopted children. They may or may not elect to be sexually exclusive. They may or may not share the same home, diet, or work schedules. What will be required is that for any morally acceptable end that the partner has, his or her ideal friend will seek to promote the partner's ability to achieve that end. Sometimes this may mean staying out of the way and letting the partner do his best to attain his end. Sometimes this may mean actively working to assist the partner in attaining her end. It will involve, as all the marriage therapists counsel, a lot of open communication so that the ideal friends understand each other's genuine, freely chosen ends, their capacities, and their limitations. As with marriage, goodwill and trust are also requisite. A commitment, understood in this way, is ideal because it maximizes the mutual investment of the partners. It will be obvious that this distinguishes ideal friends from ordinary friends, both because of the extent of the mutual involvement and because of the need in principle to attend to the sexual ends of each partner. Yet it is consistent with my view of commitment that both partners may decide that they do not wish to fulfill their sexual needs with each other or only with each other. So long as this decision is reached through a properly ethical attention to promoting the sexual autonomy of the partner, whether that includes procreation or not, there is no reason to think it a detriment to the relationship or a failure of the commitment. I have said that the ethical ideal of friendship, understood as a commitment, is permanent, but this may be misleading and requires some clarification. If the partners mutually decide that they are no longer in a position to promote each other's autonomy, and that each would be better off if freed from the commitment, then they may further exhibit or enact the commitment by ending it. I believe this is the only humane way to address a personal relationship that requires moral seriousness without requiring the sacrifice of one's prospects for individual flourishing. In other words, I take it that marriage with the possibility of divorce is the only humane solution to the fact that marriage propels people into an extremely complicated long-term interdependency. Without divorce, many millions of people have been trapped, not just by loveless marriages, but marriages that are abusive, denigrating, or lifeless on account of the incapacity of one or both partners to promote the happiness and autonomy of the other. My approach to commitment as an ethical ideal is thus parallel to marriage with the possibility of divorce. The difference is that no legal paperwork need be involved and no fault need be identified. Further, on my way of seeing the commitment as an ideal of friendship, since the rationale for the commitment consists in the willingness to maximally promote the happiness or autonomy of the partner, their separation represents an attempt to fulfill the commitment, since it's an acknowledgement that the best means to achieve the partner's happiness is to set him free, to find it in relation to something or someone else. Paradoxically, the end of the commitment is, in a sense, simply an extension or an enactment of it. Ideally, such a separation might be thought to occasion a new kind of moral attitude, almost universally lacking in divorce. Instead of perceiving the situation as a shameful failure, it may be cause for a loving, respectful, mutual acknowledgement of life's bittersweet exigencies. Far from a self-centered, trivial, fickle individualism, this attitude may allow us to see life as a joyful enterprise with many possible ways to respect and promote each other's flourishing. It may facilitate a regard for others that is more generous. Today, many blended and non-traditional families are already showing the cooperative benefits that can arise when goodwill, mutual respect, and love are allowed more free expression and the opportunity to adapt. But there's nothing new in my view of commitment as an ideal friendship that prohibits persons from forming lifelong, sexually exclusive partnerships, raising children together, and conducting themselves in ways that more or less mirror contemporary marriage. The view of commitment I have introduced is built from philosophical components of ethical theory, not religious practice or state regulation. My view captures the common hopes and dreams of many, but not all people. Captures the common hopes and dreams of many, but not all, that people have for finding a partner with whom to share a life. It allows that commitment is inspired by love and sexual desire, which may draw our attention to a particular other, without reducing the relationship to something trivial, fickle, unstable, subject to whim, or lacking in moral seriousness, as the defenders of conjugalism claim. It does not rely upon dubious claims of gender essentialism. It is morally principled, not limited to emotional intensity. And I am out of time, and I'll put the last slide, which directs anyone interested to some of my published work on the topics of marriage and love. Thank you so much. If you've hung in to listen all the way to the end, I'm so appreciative. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Sadler, for this amazing presentation. It was brilliant. I thank you for have accepted our invitation for the event.
Thank you so much. Are there questions? I don't know who's out there.
Yes, we have some questions here. I've planned to make you a question. So, but I think the presentation responded my question. So I will short it. I will make it more short.
That's all right. And I'm happy to address other areas of interest on the topic as well. In thinking about how to prepare some remarks for this today, I didn't know what the background would be and of listeners. I wanted to give a kind of comprehensive overview that would allow discussion to turn to many different topics. So please feel free to raise anything you like.
Okay. Well, my question was about your contrast that you make in your article on love and marriage in the Routledge book, with your contrast you make with Elizabeth Brake, who gave us a conference 2 days ago, if I'm sure. So then you write in contrast with one aspect of our thinking, that a lifelong commitment to respect another person and to promote her or his happiness provides a uniquely comprehensive form of ethical regard that can foster virtue, deepen self-understanding, promote compassion, and form the basis for both passion and moral love. I think it is an approach that you developed here more broadly, and it was one of my doubts. I was thinking about. I had doubts. I was curious about this ideal of commitment, but you just already talked about it. So I would like you to ask you if the specific concern with fostering compassion and other virtues, which can be further fostered in relationships of commitment, specifically, this type of relationships you've just defendant, has implications for political philosophy, since these emotions and virtues have strong political relevance for a just society, as stated, for example, by Martin Nussbaum. So I would like to ask if about these implications for political philosophy, for what you called civil justice or social engineering, and
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. Thank you, Edison. I do think that some of the most difficult, deepest questions that debates about marriage generate concern really not the personal experience of marriage or how individuals will conduct their lives, but what it means for the political sphere. How does marriage promote certain kinds of values or certain kinds of virtues? Or, and the comment that you just made, different kinds of emotional responses. And I think if we look back to comments made as early as, I'm thinking, Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, or in the mid 19th century with John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, and comments by Margaret Fuller, all these other people who are critics of marriage at the time. One of the things that they come back to again and again is the way in which marriage gives people a kind of false self-conception. When gender norms are strict, and when men and women are divided along these gender roles, it gives men a false understanding of themselves as superior. It gives women a false understanding of themselves as inferior. It gives men a sense of entitlement and the sense of control over the rational discourse, and women are sort of removed from that. So all of these problems that are located in the institution and practice of marriage that create kind of gendered differences on how we perceive reality and our place in the world, then that ramifies. It has a broader effect on society and the kinds of people we are. So I'm trying to make a kind of more contemporary connection, but we hear a lot today in the United States about toxic masculinity. I don't know if that's a phrase that's familiar to you, but
yes, it's very familiar here too
yeah.
in
And I don't want
Brazil.
to say that it's derived wholly from the institution of marriage. It's not. But it is connected to this historical division of gender roles that teaches men that they have to adopt a particular, way of being in the world to be, quote unquote, real men. And taken to extremes, that's a very negative set of emotions, aggression and hostility and superiority and intolerance and all these kinds of things that can get packaged into toxic masculinity. So I guess what I'm trying to sort of do is sort of draw some links from one thing to the next. We're never going to, when we talk about these domains of social structures and social practices, we'll never be able to make perfectly causal claims to connect everything. But certainly, I think we do want citizens to have the capacity to recognize each other as peers, as equals. And if marriage continues to promote the idea of separate gender roles with separate domains and separate faculties being employed, women are emotional, men are rational, we're not going to be able to address each other as peers. So I think civic regard really does require us to kind of break through that. It's a very sort of long-winded response, but I hope there was something there that
No,
you're
it's
concerned.
a nice response. Oh, we have a question here from Milena Martin.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Brook. Thank you for the wonderful speech. I would like to ask, according to your point of view, it is the family institution and the marriage institution the starting point of social injustices, or do these institutions reflect the cultural and social standards?
That's a wonderful question. And I think the thing I want to say first is that there's a dynamic of feedback. The marriage and family practices create the injustices that reinforce the practices that create the injustices. So it really is a sort of constantly reinforcing dynamic. But I think this idea of the man husband as breadwinner, protector, and head of household, and the woman as homemaker, nurturer, and domestic laborer, that division in American history became especially entrenched in the 19th century, the set of political, philosophical discourses that arose then. If we go back, it's building in the 18th century and the 17th century, but if we go back to the late medieval, early modern period and look at family structures then, this gender division of labor is not prominent. Men and women have different tasks, but their tasks are usually performed together with some mutual coordination in the home or on a small farm in an agrarian society. So going back in time to it's really not remote history, the late modern period, but you see people's the kind of labor they're doing and the kind of way that labor is involved in a marriage very differently. And so even just that sort of bit of historical perspective helps us to see how the contemporary idea that men and women have to occupy these sharply divided gender roles is a fabrication that's taken place over time. That maybe just recognizing the contingency of it helps us to see the possibility of change or breaking out of it. Thank you for the question.
We have another question of Jadiarbo. Professor Sadler, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your work on marriage. Something that I asked our other guest speakers and would love to hear from you as well is what part does feminist philosophy and theory play in your analysis, and how relevant is that we claim the label feminist in our research on these matters?
Oh, good question. Thank you. Um, I am very deeply influenced by feminist thought and philosophical feminism as well. And it doesn't always show up directly in the things that I write, but it's always an influence, always a background consideration. So definitely directly a part of my outlook. How important is it that you claim the term feminist? I think it's very important. I think that there is no reason to fear the word or what it means or what it stands for. There's an awful lot of misinformation, ignorance, lack of understanding about what feminism is. And the more we can own the word and own the label and educate and share those ideas, I think the better off the world will be. So, yeah, there's a lot of obviously lots of different kinds of feminist thought, lots of different feminist theories. Not all feminists think the same thing, but there is at the root of it a very fundamental orientation that recognizes that women are just as important as men, that girls are just as important as boys, and fighting for gender justice often means fighting for gains for men as well. One of the comments that I made in my presentation today was that men have not benefited from the emancipation of women in our society as much as they should. So women have been able to go get higher education and go into the workforce and take jobs and have careers and vote and participate in public life. That's been a great gain for women. We have a long ways to go to cover other issues, but that's a great gain. But men have not taken the parallel move of moving away from the public sphere to reinvest in family life, in the benefits of fatherhood as an actual relationship, not just a biological contribution, right? So I think feminism teaches us that gender norms and gender roles can be damaging to both men and women. Own the label.
Yes, we have one more last question of Michele Seixas da Silva. Thank you very much, Professor Sadler. Why, in your definition of commitment, you talks about an ethical ideal of friendship and not about an ethical ideal of love?
Oh, I'm
Marriage,
sorry.
there's
Go
two
ahead.
questions. Marriage isn't about only friendship, but basically about love, isn't it?
This is a great question. I'm so happy someone asked it too. I have written extensively about love in other places, and love is a very tricky concept. Has so many meanings. Ask any two people, you'll get a different answer on what love is. So certainly a lot of people have been acculturated today to believe that marrying by choice means marrying for love. But this is a very new historical development. For most of the history of the West, at any rate, marriage was not promoted on the basis of love. It was nice if you did love the person you married. Love might follow sometime after the marriage, but the idea that the reason you got married was because you were in love, that's a very recent historical development. Even as late as in the late 19th century, talking about marrying for love is regarded as, sort of a kind of luxury position, a kind of unrealistic luxury to have the idea that you could marry for love rather than marry for establishing kinship relations or marrying in order to extend economic resources or to secure financial stability or to combine assets and property. Right? Reasons for marriage really were quite a bit more pragmatic than romantic. In fact, if you look in the medieval period, some of the conceptions of love are divorce it altogether from marriage. Love occurs outside of marriage. And of course, throughout much of the world and much of history, marriages have been arranged. So your elders chose your spouse for you, and maybe love would follow, but it was not the reason for the marriage. So, it's certainly, this is part of the social practice, is that love has become a dominant sort of rationale or motive for people to marry. I encourage people to be a little bit circumspect about that idea. Um, Researchers who look at erotic or romantic love find that it usually only lasts a couple of years. That sort of exhilarating feeling of being in love usually lasts a couple of years. And then there is a big shift in the emotional and relational quality of, of the marriage partner's lives, a shift that we might better describe as friendship. Um, you might, or as a different kind of love, a more sober or mature love, some people say. Right? I have written about this elsewhere, so I could point you to some things, and there are other writers too. Um, I think my view is fully compatible with marrying for love or seeking a commitment on the basis of love, but it has to go beyond that in order to secure the commitment against the possibility of changing feelings.
Okay, well, thank you one more time very much for your presentation, for your you accepted our invitation, and you you may have a final word if you want. So
Well, thank you. I think it's really wonderful that you have put together this opportunity for so many people to speak on this topic. And I'm just so appreciative of your invitation. And I hope that I can hear more from people in the future. If you want to send me an email or send me something to read, I'm always happy to hear what you were thinking. I'd love to know more about marriage practice in Brazil and what debates you all are really focused on.
yes, I think with more time in a next occasion we can talk with more time about Brazil and about this kind of questions and problems in Brazil. So, but thank you,
Thank you.
and I hope we see you later in another opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's it. Bye.
Bye-bye.